There's another thing I wanted to bring up that I thought was interesting within the news cycle, and this had to do with the United Nations. I forget who the undersecretary, whatever, the guy that's covering, he does a lot of the food programs within the United Nations. And they were talking about how much wealth Elon Musk had. And so this guy puts out this statement going, well, with $6 billion, we could feed all of the hungry people. Like he made this really, really kind of outlandish statement that if only Elon Musk would hand over his money, then they could, solve world hunger. It wasn't quite that bad, but pretty dang close. And so Elon Musk called him on it. He said, okay, great, show me a proposal and I might just do it. Right? And this is one of the things I love about Elon Musk, right? This guy has swagger. And it's not to say I always agree with Elon Musk. It's not to say that I always agree with all the ways that he's made his money, because some of it has come through government subsidies, which I'm not a fan of. But in the end, he's put a lot of time and attention on focusing on building products and services that people want, right? The primary reason why he is so wealthy is because he is focused on appealing to customers and investors, all right, not confiscating your money through taxation. So he comes back at the UN, he says, okay, give me a proposal. Now, before the UN comes back with the proposal, there's a couple things you need to point out. Somebody went on there and immediately said, really, that's interesting. With $6 billion, you could solve all these problems because you raised $12 billion. You spent $12 billion already. How come you haven't solved it? Right? And this is one of the primary issues with the UN, is it's this idea that if we just had your money, we would spend it so much more nobly than you would spend it. All right, we would spend it curing hunger, whereas you're only spending it on products and services that makes people's lives better, right? So that's fun. But the UN came back and said, okay, we're going to present you a proposal. And they went through and they worked out all the money they would spend on purchasing food, delivering food, the different programs that would go into it. And as you're reading through this, I mean, I'm looking at this going, this many people that they would help as refugees in Afghanistan. And I'm thinking, I know exactly how this is going to go down. And anybody that has any history or understands how the UN operates, we all kind of know how this is going to go down in some of these countries that they want to deliver food to. It's going to go like this. They're going to take a ton of money, and then they're going to pay off local warlords and third world dictators and terrorist and criminal organizations. And they're going to pay them off in a couple of ways. One is going to be, hey, can we please give food to your hungry people? Right? So that's the first bribe. Then you're going to get in there and it's going to be all kinds of conditions on how you get the food to them. You've got to use, the cousin of the premier in order to ship your food to a particular location. Right? Then at some point along the way, it's going to be confiscated by some rogue warlord who's then going to take the food and use it in order to increase his own power base as he oppresses the population. Then the UN is going to have to spend additional money on bringing troops in order to protect the food shipments. Now, if history is any guide, there's maybe a 50-50 shot that these UN troops either get outgunned or captured by these various warlords, and now the UN essentially has to pay ransoms in order to get those people back. And maybe they get some of the food back, maybe they don't get some of the food back, but ultimately this ends up becoming a token that warlords are now fighting on within these countries, that the UN paid for using, presumably, Elon Musk's money. Right, so as I'm looking at all the different policies, they make it sound simple, like we're going to buy this much food and then there's going to be this much transportation and logistical costs in order to provide it to these people that are hungry in Afghanistan. And you just know that because it's the UN, they're going to pay way too much, they're going to pay a bunch of bribes, there's going to be fraud, waste, and abuse, there's going to be embezzlement from people within the UN in order to ship all this. And I'm thinking to myself, Elon, please, I think your heart's in the right place. But I have far more faith in Elon Musk to come up with a way to execute this and feed hungry people than I do the United Nations. Because the other big thing with the United Nations is here's their plan. We're going to take a bunch of food and we're going to give it to a bunch of people. Cool. Is there any sustainability on that? Or are you just going to come back to Elon Musk every year for another $6 billion in order to feed people? Like at what point do you actually set up significant infrastructure that allows people to, feed themselves? Because ultimately that's what they want. Do you think anybody in the world right now is living in absolute destitute poverty, thinking to themselves, gosh, I sure hope I can live the rest of my life where some billionaire in another country that is far more stable, that is operating off of, representative principles, rule of law, and, oh, by the way, free market economic systems that allow them to acquire such wealth. You think anybody is sitting in those countries going, no, I don't want that for myself. I just want to continue to live off of, the benevolence of people in other countries and corrupt international organizations to get it to me. Preferably directly to me and not through a warlord or a violent dictator. Preferably. But let's face it, the UN's going to do whatever they need to do in order to make the commercial showing about how great the UN is. So they can have another swanky party somewhere showing about how great they are and how horrible capitalists are, even though, amazingly enough, the UN wouldn't have a fraction of the money they currently spend if it wasn't for free market capitalist economies that provide the sort of economic opportunity that we should be exporting to the rest of the world. Right? The UN doesn't want to export the system that actually works. No, they just want to reapportion and redistribute the money. Because let's face it, if we ever got to a point where those countries actually did have the kind of stability and free market policies that allowed them to be able to build themselves out of poverty, why would we need all those positions at the United Nations? And this is one of the points that Thomas Sowell has brought up, is that when we look at government agencies and we look at government programs, it's important to understand that the people within those institutions and programs, no matter how benevolent their intentions might be, they have their own interests. And their interests, when they become a part of that program, inevitably becomes not just to hand out nice things to people in need, but to build the power, influence, and budget of their own organizations, regardless of whether or not they're actually achieving the end state. So please, Elon, love you, man. Don't give $6 billion to the United Nations in order to feed hungry people. I'm not saying don't feed hungry people. I'm not saying don't provide opportunities. But what the people in many of these countries need, and I'm not talking about some of the refugee situations where you do have people in high distress and providing the sort of stability where they can take care of themselves is a long way in the future. I understand prioritizing that. I'm talking about some of these other areas where what they really need is economic opportunities that come through private property rights and free market principles, not the sort of socialist redistribution that the UN does so incredibly poorly. So let's not prop up an organization that has a horrible track record on this. Right? They can point to a hungry person they fed all day long and say, look at the great thing we did. And that instance may be great, but when you look at how much they cost, how much embezzlement, how much fraud, how much danger, how many third world warlords were propped up by the way the UN did it, you have to take that into consideration too before you give massive amounts of money to such an organization.